Hello everyone. Today we will be reviewing the first part of Chapter 1 and going over the evolution of a science. And so to begin with, what we are going to talk about is really the origin of psychology and how early philosophers viewed psychology. And so what we'll actually review today is what is the definition of psychology, where did we start out, and how did psychology actually come to be through the roots of psychology, whether that's philosophy, biology, or physiology. And then we'll come back to America and talk about how did we take those ideas from Western society and bring them to America, and who were those early forerunners that brought psychology to America. And so when we actually think of psychology and the definition, today's society has taken psychology and popularized it in different shows and different TV shows and different movies. And so as we can see from the slide, we have Criminal Minds, we have one of my favorite movies, Silence of the Lambs. We have A Beautiful Mind, and we also have Dexter. And so they've taken the study of psychology and have actually fused it into their TV shows in different ways. And so we'll actually talk about what does psychology mean, what is the study of psychology. And so when we think of psychology, the chapter actually gives a definition of psychology as the scientific study of the mind and our behavior. So psychology provides us a systematic look and scientific study of behavior and mental processes that underlie and influence our behavior. And so we'll talk about this connection between the mind and our behavior throughout this whole presentation. And so what does the mind actually mean? If we try to define it in any kind of way, this is one of the major points for philosophers in terms of trying to define what is the mind, what is our behavior, what is psychology even, what does it even entail. And so the chapter describes the mind as our private inner experience, so our thoughts, our perceptions, so the way we see people, the way we see different situations, and how we perceive those situations is really what is made up of the mind. And so the next definition of what we want to look at in terms of psychology is behavior. And so what is behavior? Behavior is the observable actions of human beings and animals. And so our behavior may involve the things we do in the world, by ourselves, and with others. And so those are the basic definitions of what makes up psychology. And so next, what actually makes psychology a science? And before I really get into this history of psychology, I would like to explain what makes the field of psychology a scientific one. And specifically, there are 4 big goals and common questions that we often try to answer through scientific inquiry. And so our 4 big goals within psychology as a science are to describe, to explain, to predict, and to control. So we want to describe and provide explanations necessary for understanding and justifying any behavior. So why does a person behave in a specific way? Also, predictions and the ability to exert control is necessary for future or prevention or modification of behavior. So that's a lot of jargon, but really what the essence of that is how can we predict someone's behavior and how can we learn to control it? So I'm a child person, and so this or a child researcher, and so this really goes along with my type of research. So how can we predict when a child is going to misbehave? Is it when mom gives in to his temper tantrum? How can we actually control that behavior? So how can we when do we know which situations he is going to have a temper tantrum, and when can we intervene and we can help mom or dad learn new parenting strategies that will be effective in lessening or decreasing the frequency or the amount or how many times he has a temper tantrum. And so when we look at common questions in psychology, what we see, and that we'll also see through this history of psychology, is this common question of nature versus nurture. And so, was someone born to be this way? Or was that little kid, was he always destined to be a little pain in the butt, or was he raised to be that way? And so this is a common question that we'll actually look at and examine throughout this whole presentation, even throughout the whole course of answering, is it nature? Are we born this way, or is it nurture? Do we end up this way from our experiences, our past experiences, our current experiences? And so this is a very common question. The next is altruism versus selfishness. And so with this question is, are human beings capable of acting in ways that do not benefit themselves in any way? And so that really is the essence of altruism. And another question is, or the second part of that question is, do we always act with ulterior motives, such as selfishness? So if we think of an altruistic type of employment, I would say maybe a firefighter or a cop. Are these individuals altruistic? So are they doing this for the betterment of the community, for their people, or is it because they get some kind of gain in terms of they feel satisfied with themselves? It makes them feel good to help people. And so this is a real true question that's often asked, is, are people altruistic or selfishness? And then the last common question that we see is emotion versus reason. And so do we rely on emotions to make decisions or behave in certain ways, or do we base our actions on reason? And I'm sure you can think of times that you've just flown off the handle and you were solely basing your behavior or your reactions were based on emotion. But at other times when it's necessary for you to just stop and think and reason, we find ourselves coming to a different conclusion than if we were to just fly off the handle based on our emotions. And so with any of these three questions, in almost any of the questions that we answer in psychology, the answer is it depends. And so a person could could fly off the handle at one point, but then in that later that day, or even after they got over those emotions, you were able to reason enough to come to a different conclusion. So it depends, but also one answer could be there's a little bit of both. So all of us are born with some knowledge. So we're born knowing not to touch a hot stove. But there's also knowledge that we have that we gain from experience. So we understand that if we study, we read, we take notes, we go to class, then we'll make an A in class. And so there's different types of knowledge that we gain from our experiences. And then also there's knowledge that we were innately born with. And so again, answers to the common questions are it depends, and then some of both. So we'll go more further into discussion into each one of these throughout the whole course. And so when we talk about psychology's roots, I like this flowchart because it's nice to see. It's kind of a nice visual to see all of those that we'll be talking about that led to the development of psychology. And so here we have the 4th century BC, ancient Greek philosophers, going on to the 17th century with Descartes and German philosophers. the mid-19th century with when physiology came about, and this was where they were studying the physical nature of things, which ultimately gave scientists insight into how the mind and the brain actually work. The late 19th century, when the first laboratory was created, and a variety of techniques were made for examining the mind. Here we have phrenology, which we'll actually talk about here in a little bit, and then here we have the turn of the 20th century, and it wasn't really until this time that psychology started to grow into what we actually know it as today. And so here we start off with the philosophical origins and those ancient Greek philosophers that we had mentioned in the previous slide. So nativism is really getting at half of that question of, is it nature or nurture? And so nativism posits that some knowledge is innate, so we're born with it. And so I know not to touch a hot stove. I didn't have to experience the singeing pain that comes from touching a hot stove. I just know that it's hot and I have to stay away. Versus Aristotle's view of empiricism and individuals being a tabula rasa. And empiricism believes that all knowledge is gained or can be gained from physical sensory experience, and the mind is this blank slate or tabula rasa. And so the example that I gave earlier for the nurture part that we learn from all experience is that I go to class, or I've just spent 12 years of my life in public school. I went to class, I read my book, I took notes in order to be successful, in order to get an A in that class. And so my knowledge is based off of my past experiences. And so that's really what Aristotle was talking about with empiricism and tabula rasa. So again, nativism in Plato is that nature part of the question, and Aristotle and empiricism is really that nurture part of the problem, or of the question. And so when we look at the last part of this philosophical origins, we talk about Descartes and Gall. And so Descartes posited that there was a dualism between the mind and the body. So he believed that the mind and the body were two separate beings, and they interacted through this pineal gland. And he believed that it was possible that our mind exerted power over our body through this gland in our body. And this tiny pineal gland is at the base of the brain. And he was actually on the right track in terms of the mind influencing our behavior, yet his theory was incomplete. And so as we'll see through the views of Plato, Aristotle, Descartes, and in the next slide, Gall, what we see is that to some extent all of them are correct in some form. But from our examples, some knowledge is innate and some is from our past experience. And to some extent, Descartes was what he found in terms of the mind and the body being separate was true. But it wasn't a full explanation for what the interaction between our mind and our body was. So our mind and behavior, our thoughts and behavior, how are these actually connected? He wasn't getting at the full explanation. And so with here, we will go on to talking about Gall. And so with Gall, he came up or theorized about phrenology. And so this is where we saw that little man's head with all of these different areas or these different markings on his head. And with this, Joseph Gall was a French physician, and he believed or theorized that our mental abilities and characteristics are located on the specific areas of our brain. And they understood this as through feeling bumps on your head. And so if you had literally had a big head, then they would say that you may have an inflated sense of self-worth. So phrenology was one of those first theories that claimed that different parts of the brain had different functions. And so that's going to be important because that was a building block to what we know as psychology is today. And so we're taking little pieces of each of these theories and these beliefs, and we're taking the good and leaving the bad, essentially. And so what we found out, what was true about phrenology, was that abilities are localized in the brain. So we know that, for example, vision is located in the occipital lobe, which is located near the back of the base of the brain. So we know that within that region, if you receive maybe a blow to the head, or if you've ever been playing sports and you maybe fell back on your head and were knocked out, or you lost consciousness, your vision may have been blurry. It's because your vision is actually located at the base of your brain. When we talk about biological origins, what we see are a few of these key or prominent figures in psychology and developing psychology. And so first we talk about Florence. And so Florence actually took phrenology and revised it to become more scientific. And Florence and Broca connected the mind to the body, connected the mind to the brain through surgical methods, which disproved Descartes' idea that the mind exerted control through this one tiny gland. And they basically established that the body is connected to the mind through surgical methods. And together they provided a basis for the mind actually being located in the brain. And therefore, people could begin to look at specific processes like thoughts and perceptions and emotions by looking at the brain. And so with Broca, he actually worked separately from Florence, and Broca worked with brain damage patients that had been brain damaged and could not speak but could actually understand language. And his line of research led to the discovery of the Broca's area of the brain, which is responsible for understanding language or comprehending language. And his research suggested that the mind is grounded in material processes of the brain. And so, our mind is connected to our brain. And so, when we talk about the physiological origins of psychology, physiology is the study of biological processes in the body. In the 1800s, psychology benefited from German scientists who were trained in physiology. And so William James, who your chapter talks a lot about, and the book in whole talks a lot about, was most interested in the work of two physiologists, Helmholtz and Wundt. And both of these men observed and tested psychological constructs like the mind scientifically. Here, with biological and physiological origins, we're starting to shift the field of psychology from a philosophical debate of nature versus nurture to more scientific inquiry, at the urging of the scientific method. So we're using all of these scientific methods in order to understand the connection between mind and behavior. And so Helmholtz studied human reaction time, and his research was able to estimate the length of a nerve impulse in comparing the length of a nerve impulse from the toe to the brain versus a nerve impulse from the thigh to the brain. And what we see from this is that he was the first to actually show that this process was not an instantaneous process. So leading us to Wilhelm Wundt, the second inspiration for William James. Wilhelm Wundt is actually the father of psychology. And with Wilhelm Wundt, in 1874, he opened the first research lab to be exclusively dedicated to psychological studies. He was the developer of structuralism, and he attempted to analyze the mind's most basic elements of physical sensations and feelings. And so structuralism is, in essence, is just what is the structure of basic elements. What are these elements of physical sensations, and what are the elements of feelings? And he did this through introspection, which is the individual's perception or observation of their own experience. And so he did this through experimental methods, which is important because before then there was more of theorizing and debating what was psychology, what is the mind, and what is behavior. And Wilhelm Wundt was really the forerunner in terms of establishing scientific method. And so with this, we talk about how psychology comes to America. And Titchener actually studied under Wundt, and he was strict about psychology being experimental, not clinical or abnormal, so not the interest of conducting therapy with the client, but more of testing and learning more about experiments or learning more from experiments. And so he was different from Wundt in that he sought to describe rather than explain consciousness, or conscientiousness, not consciousness. So William James developed a different approach to psychology known as functionalism. And so William James developed this different approach to psychology, and he studied the purpose of these mental processes and why they serve in enabling us to adapt to our environment. So basically what he was looking at is what mental processes are functional or adaptive for us as humans to have, and which processes will survive. So here we can see some kind of influence of Charles Darwin's work on William James's viewpoints of psychology. So he believed it was psychologists' work to research the function of consciousness. He wanted to understand, why do we have these thoughts, or why do we have these perceptions, these feelings, what it serves, what function do they serve in helping us to adapt to our environment. And so here, what we see is that Titchener and James strayed from structuralism because it focuses on the function of mental processes, the what and the how, instead of why. On our last slide, when we talk about psychology and it coming over to America, we talk about G. Stanley Hall. And G. Stanley Hall was also pivotal in the enhancement of functionalism because of his shared beliefs in evolution. His primary focus was in childhood development and how children develop today and go through developmental stages he believed were similar to childhood development of our ancestors, and this is known as the recapitulation theory. And with G. Stanley Hall, he was also pivotal in the role of psychology flourishing as a field in America because he was the founder of the first psychological research lab in North America. So Wundt had the first psychology lab ever, and G. Stanley Hall was the founder of the first research lab in America, and he established that in 1881 at Johns Hopkins University. He also founded the first psychological journal in America, which is the American Journal of Psychology, and was founded the first professional organization of psychologists, which is now known as the American Psychological Association. So the association for psychologists. He founded all three of these major areas of psychology in America and helping to bring psychology